the Poles are definitely helping the Ukrainians now with all forms of direct military aid in the form of weapons. It's a long list to mention all of the weapon systems that had been sent there, but of the most important, naturally, we have the MiG-29 fighter jets that Poland has sent, more than a dozen, and then the tanks, which really played an important role in last year's Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kherson and Kharkiv region. The Poles have, back then they had sent around 250 T-72 tanks. By now they have sent even more than 335 tanks, all in all, which is more main battle tanks than all other countries taken together. So the Poles, they have really contributed to that iron fist which the Ukrainians are using in countering Russian attacks. Finally have other forms of weapons. Probably the self-propelled Krab howitzer is the most famous one, but we should also not forget about older Soviet equipment, Soviet era equipment, such as the BMP-1s, the infantry fighting vehicle, or the BM-21 Grad, the multiple launch rocket system that it's a modernized version basically of the so-called Katyusha from the Second World War that many people might remember, or also known as Stalin's organ, I believe. Organ as in
the musical instrument.
The musical instrument
Yes.
that you can see in a church, because they do look slightly similar with these tubes that are being used to fire all those missiles. The Poles have also played a very important role in providing Ukraine with drones, which in this war have really come into their own and become paramount on the battlefield. The Poles have sent both Warmate loitering munitions or suicide drones, also Fly-Eye reconnaissance drones that are being used to correct artillery fire especially. And then also not to be forgotten is that Poland has provided Ukraine with almost half of its 40,000 Starlink satellite receivers. Naturally, the Ukrainians have been using Starlink as a way to stay online in those regions of the front line where Russian electronic warfare capabilities are high, and they are able to use electronic measures to interfere with internet signals in the Ukrainian held territories. So their Starlink is really crucial for the Ukrainian war effort. So this cooperation that we saw in the 1920 during the Polish-Soviet War, it is now almost exactly a century later. It is seeing a second phase. Of course, in 1991, Ukraine became an independent state, which was the goal of Marshal Pilsudski in 1920, and it was a Ukrainian state that was bigger than Marshal Pilsudski probably would have been able to dream about in the 1920s, as at that time he would have probably been content with a Ukraine that would have included Kiev, Poltava, Zaporizhia. But if cities such as Lugansk and or Luhansk and Donetsk would have not been included in that Ukrainian state in 1920, it's not something that Marshal Pilsudski would have lost any sleep over. So the Ukrainian state that did appear on the political maps of Europe in 1991 was a much larger state than Pilsudski would have dreamt about, and for Poland it was truly one of the greatest geopolitical wins in recent centuries, that there was an independent Belarus and an independent Ukraine created after the fall of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, in 1995 in Belarus, Lukashenko came to power, and the likelihood of Belarus moving in a Western direction diminished. In Ukraine also, the Ukrainians were somewhat on the fence, trying to play some form of non-alignment policy similar to that of the non-alignment movement of the Cold War. They were trying to balance the West and the East, meaning Europe and the US, against Russia, trying to win favor sometimes from one side, sometimes from the other. But in the end, now in hindsight, I think most Ukrainians do realize that back in 1991 they should have tried to really go all out in their effort to become a member of the Western political community, mainly the European community, or later on the European Union.
Which is something which allegedly may happen by 2030.
Yes, that is at least the goal. Zelensky now has stated that they are preparing to complete their membership process by the end of this year, as in that they need to introduce all the reforms that the European Union mandates and to get on that path. But whether it will happen is slightly
anybody's guess. But anyway, that's probably an optimistic note on which to end. Thank you for that, Adam. That's been fascinating. Well, there we have it. A very interesting, I think, perspective on the Polish, I call it the Polish-Soviet War, and the Ukrainian contribution to it. And who would have thought, as Adam said, 100 years later, we'd be watching Ukrainian forces fighting Russian forces in Ukraine. History may not rhyme, but it often repeats itself, and I forget who said that. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History.